Mom and Dad secretly canceled my college applications to help my brother, but now they lost their inheritance to me, and I have zero regrets about it. Hey everyone. So my parents recently faced some serious consequences for what they did to me, and I made it clear to them that they completely deserved it. I don't feel the slightest bit sorry for them. In fact, I even allowed myself to gloat a little. I thought I had earned that right. But a couple of my friends told me that was unnecessary. I'm 17 and in just a few weeks, I'm supposed to be starting college. I had applied to multiple business schools outside of my state because I wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and my parents. I didn't think they would care about me leaving either, and I was right. But despite that, they still took it upon themselves to go behind my back and sabotage my future, something I only found out about recently. And all of it was because of my brother. He's insecure, jealous, and absolutely cannot stand the idea of me being happy or successful. He's been struggling in school for years, flunking classes, failing tests, and no matter what, he never seems to improve. I know exactly why. Instead of focusing on school, he spends all his time trying to impress people, desperate for validation from the so-called cool kids. And yet, for some reason, my parents refuse to acknowledge that. I've never seen my brother actually study when he's at home, and that's a big part of the problem. But instead of addressing it, my parents have spent the last few months dragging him to specialists, trying to find some kind of learning disability to blame. This all started after his high school counselor pulled them aside and warned them that if they didn't intervene, he wouldn't get into any decent colleges. He has 2 years left before graduation, and if his grades don't improve, he'll have no choice but to go to community college. And that, more than anything, was what my parents couldn't handle. I honestly didn't care. They could make whatever excuses they wanted for their golden child. It wasn't my problem. I had my own future to focus on, and I was determined to get into a great business school so I could move on with my life. To give myself the best possible shot, I applied to Stanford. Everyone knows how big of a deal Stanford is, and while I wasn't guaranteed a spot, my grades were solid. A couple of my friends even said they expected me to get in, so I figured it was worth a shot. Even if I didn't make it, at least I could say I tried. But apparently, my parents weren't okay with that. A few days after I submitted my application, they sent an email, pretending to be me, and withdrew it. They didn't tell me. They didn't warn me. They just made the decision for me and ensured that I wouldn't even have a chance. Recently, I started receiving responses from the other colleges I had applied to, and I got accepted into most of them. That was great news because it meant I had plenty of options. But something felt off. Stanford hadn't sent me anything. Even when a school rejects someone, they at least send a formal response. But I heard nothing. My friends started asking me about it, and I had no answer for them. I wasn't patient enough to wait around, so I decided to check my application status. That's when I realized something was wrong. I couldn't find my application in the admissions portal at all. I checked my email, including my spam folder. Nothing. No acceptance, no rejection, no updates of any kind. With no other options left, I finally called Stanford's admissions office to find out what was going on. Thinking it must have been some kind of glitch, I called the admissions office. Later, they got back to me and casually told me that I had withdrawn my own application via email, which was why they hadn't bothered to follow up. I was in complete disbelief. That was impossible. I told them there had to be some mistake because I knew I had submitted my application. But they confirmed that an email had been sent just a few days after I applied, requesting a withdrawal. That's why they had canceled it. They didn't have much time to talk, so I was left sitting there in shock for the rest of the day. I kept searching for any kind of explanation, but no matter how much I went over it, the truth became undeniable. Someone had sabotaged me. At first, I immediately thought of my brother. Who else would be jealous enough to do something like this? But as I watched him over the next few days, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He was still arrogant, annoying, and full of himself. If he had done something like this, he would have been rubbing it in my face. But he wasn't. That made me doubt whether he was actually the one responsible. A couple of days later, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know the truth. I went straight into his room and confronted him. The moment I asked him about it, he looked confused, and for a second, I almost believed it was genuine. But I didn't trust him, so I kept pushing. That's when he got irritated and started yelling at me. He swore he didn't even know how to access my email, and then, just to be a jerk, he added that if he had known, he would have withdrawn all of my applications. That way, I'd have zero options and wouldn't be strutting around the house celebrating my acceptance emails. That set me off. I was already furious, and his attitude just pushed me over the edge. We started shouting at each other, and before I knew it, we were physically fighting. As soon as my parents heard the commotion, they ran in to break us apart. But at that moment, I completely lost it. Maybe it was the fact that someone had deliberately sabotaged me, because things like this don't just happen. Or maybe it was just all the pent-up frustration finally boiling over. Either way, I wasn't holding back. I barely even registered my parents trying to pull me off him. My dad eventually had to restrain me to stop me from going after him again. And that's when my mom blurted out the truth. It wasn't him. We withdrew your application. I completely froze. I stopped struggling, stopped fighting. Everything just went still. I had never expected that. Betrayal, hurt, shock. It all hit me at once. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. We just stood there in silence while I tried to process what I had just heard. When I didn't respond, my mom, already in tears, started explaining. She told me that she and my dad had always had access to my email. Before I got my own laptop, I used to use my dad's, and apparently, I had never logged out. At the time, I hadn't thought it was important. Then she admitted that when I started applying to colleges, it happened to be around the same time my brother's high school counselor told them he was at risk of having no options but community college. The situation had been bad enough that the counselor compared him to me, pointing out that while I had multiple opportunities ahead of me, my brother wasn't going to have the same choices. She had suggested that my parents encourage him to talk to me, hoping I could help him academically, maybe even tutor him. It was well-intentioned advice. She had no idea that my brother and I had a terrible relationship. But my parents saw it differently. Instead of recognizing that my brother was struggling because of his own poor choices, they convinced themselves that I was the reason he was doing so badly, that my success was putting too much pressure on him, that he felt like he had to outperform me, or at least match me, and that pressure was ruining him. My parents had been growing more and more concerned about my brother, and at some point, my dad suggested going through my email to see which colleges I was applying to. Since I had never discussed it with them, he wanted to make sure my choices weren't going to make my brother feel even more inferior to me. Most of my applications were to reasonable, attainable schools, but then they saw Stanford. And that's when it hit them. If I got accepted, my brother would never escape the comparison. For the rest of his life, he would be the one who had to live in the shadow of his high-achieving older sibling who went to Stanford and earned a prestigious business degree. They convinced themselves that it would destroy his mental health. At first, they weren't sure what to do. But after a couple of days, my mom suggested a solution. What if they just withdrew my application? I wouldn't even have to know. They had access to my email. They knew my application ID and all the necessary details. It would be sneaky and unethical, but in their minds, it was for the greater good. If I never got into Stanford, my brother wouldn't have to suffer the embarrassment of constantly being compared to me. They went back and forth on the idea for a few more days, but ultimately, they decided that this was the best thing for the family. Since my application was still in the review stage, all they had to do was send an electronic withdrawal request. Stanford followed up with a confirmation email, which my parents handled on my behalf. They made sure to delete every trace of their actions, knowing that if I checked my email, I wouldn't find anything suspicious. They also got lucky that I never checked the application portal. I assumed all communication would be through email, which is how most schools do it. At the time, I was overwhelmed with finals and other college applications. I wasn't confident that I would even get into Stanford, so I focused on applying to multiple schools. I was too distracted to notice anything out of the ordinary. Unfortunately, that meant I never checked the portal when I should have. If I had, I might have caught on before it was too late. But now, there was nothing I could do. My own parents had sabotaged me, and I had no choice but to sit with that betrayal. After my mom finally admitted everything, both she and my dad immediately tried to comfort me. Even my brother looked genuinely surprised. They apologized over and over, claiming they had been so focused on my brother's struggles that they hadn't stopped to consider the consequences. Even now, despite everything, they still insisted that me getting into Stanford would have been devastating for my brother's mental health. But I didn't care. I had heard enough. I shook them off and locked myself in my room. I couldn't stand to be in that house for even one more minute. I started packing, shoving whatever I could fit into my bags. My parents kept knocking on my door, begging me to talk, but I ignored them. Once I was packed, I called a cab. As I walked out the door, my parents made one last attempt to stop me, but I refused to even look at them. I got into the car and left. I didn't hesitate about where to go. My paternal grandparents lived nearby, so I headed straight there. When I arrived, I told them everything. They had always known my parents favored my brother, but this was something else. My grandfather completely lost it. While my grandmother tried to comfort me, I finally let myself break down. For the first time, I allowed myself to cry. Meanwhile, my grandpa was on the phone, furious, yelling at my parents. I could hear them trying to defend themselves, but he wasn't having it. He tore into them completely. A few minutes later, he made another phone call, this time much calmer. I wasn't sure who he was speaking to, but when he returned to the living room, he sat down next to me. By then, I had pulled myself together, wiping my face and taking a deep breath. He reassured me that my maternal grandparents would be arriving the next day, and that all four of them would figure out what to do next. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and promised, "I will fix this. You don't need to worry anymore." I wasn't sure what my grandfather meant, but I was too drained to ask, so I let it go. The next day, my other grandparents arrived, and for the first time, all four of them were in the same place. As soon as they got there, they reassured me that they would do everything they could to fix the situation. Obviously, getting me into Stanford at this point wasn't an option. But they told me something just as life-changing. Whatever expenses I had, whether it was tuition, housing, or daily living costs, they would cover all of it. That was huge. College is expensive, and my parents had made it clear from the start that I would either have to work my way through school or take out student loans. I had already planned on borrowing money, maybe with a little help from them, and working part-time to pay it off. My parents had been very clear. Neither my brother nor I would be getting any financial support from them. And honestly, that was probably the only fair thing they had ever done. No matter how much they doted on my brother, they weren't going to fund his education either. Not that it mattered, considering his grades. He might not even get into college. When my grandparents told me they'd pay for everything, I was beyond grateful. But there was more. Apparently, while I had been sleeping the night before, they had been discussing things among themselves. And they came to a decision. What my parents had done wasn't just cruel, it was unforgivable. They had no desire to maintain a relationship with them after this. So, they had already spoken to their lawyers. They were cutting my parents out of their wills entirely, and I would be the sole inheritor. That news shook me. I hadn't expected it at all. I didn't even know what to say, but when I tried to thank them, they told me I didn't need to. After everything I had been through, they were the ones who should be apologizing to me. They blamed themselves for not raising better children. Children who would have been good parents to me. Even though I felt much better knowing I had their support, I could tell they were still upset. If anything, they seemed more disappointed in my parents than I was. But I did my best to keep things lighthearted around them, and it seemed to help. That all happened 3 days ago, and I've been staying with my grandparents ever since. My parents tried to stop me when I left, but after I walked out, they didn't even bother reaching out. My maternal grandparents are still here for now, though they plan to leave by the end of the week. They only came to make sure I was okay, and now that they know I am, they're heading back home. Then, last night, I got a call from my parents' side of the family. But it wasn't an apology. Instead, they accused me of being a snitch. Apparently, just a few hours before that call, all 4 of my grandparents had collectively confronted my parents. They made it clear that they were disgusted by their actions and wanted nothing to do with them anymore. They also informed them that they were being completely cut out of their inheritance, and the legal process had already started. Everything would be going to me, because I deserved it far more than they ever would. Up until then, my parents had been pretending to be apologetic. But after hearing this, their true colors came out. They went from regretful to furious in an instant. They demanded that I talk to my grandparents and fix this, because, according to them, there was no way they were going to let me walk away with everything. And that's when I decided to really rub it in. I told them they had earned this. Every bit of it. They brought this on themselves, and I was glad my grandparents had cut them off, both financially and emotionally. I made sure to remind them that my college was fully covered now, so they could keep coddling my brother all they wanted. But realistically, it wasn't like he was going anywhere important in life. So at least they wouldn't have to worry about spending their savings on his tuition. And then I added, just to twist the knife a little deeper, that they didn't need to stress about their future. Because if they ever needed help in their old age, well, I'd be more than happy to put them in touch with charities that assist the financially struggling, since, at this rate, all their money would probably go towards supporting my brother for the rest of his life. And now that their inheritance was gone, they really needed to start saving up. Or, wait for me to help them find a charity that could assist them someday. I guess that was the final straw. After that, they completely lost it, screaming incoherently, throwing out every insult they could think of. I could barely even understand them between all the cursing. So, I did the only logical thing. I hung up and blocked them. And honestly, it felt great. But then, I made the mistake of telling a few of my friends about it. I assumed they'd be on my side since they knew everything. But instead, they told me I had taken things too far. They said I could have just taken my win and moved on with some dignity. That turned into an argument, and now I feel kind of bad about it. My grandparents haven't said anything, so I don't think they know about this yet. But I also don't want to bring it up myself. I don't want to seem cocky. I don't really know how to feel about all of this. So, am I the jerk for gloating to my parents now that I know their inheritance is mine? Edit. I've never had a good relationship with my brother. Never have, never will. My parents are responsible for how differently they've treated us, but he is no innocent victim either. He's a complete wannabe and even a bit of a bully at school, which is honestly embarrassing for me. He's never been kind to me, not even when we were little kids. That's why there's always been bad blood between us. As for why my grandparents never rescued me from my parents, there was nothing to rescue me from. They couldn't legally do anything. My parents weren't abusive, neglectful, or isolating me. Our relationship was just complicated and strained. When it comes to situations like mine, kids just have to deal with it because there isn't much that can be done. For those saying my grandparents should have fought for my custody when I was younger, that was never an option. No court would have entertained it, and my parents never would have given me up voluntarily. That would have made them look bad. And if they weren't willing to let me go, my grandparents had no legal power to intervene. I didn't even consider moving out until recently, when things became truly unbearable. Before that, I had just accepted my fate and was counting down the days until college so I could finally leave. I hope this clears up why I've been so against my brother this whole time and why I didn't move out sooner. A lot of people had questions about that. Update 1. After thinking it over and reading through the comments, I've realized something. I don't owe my friends an explanation. Most of them grew up in stable, loving homes. They have no idea what it's like to deal with parents like mine. They haven't been through what I have. If I want to gloat, I will. I earned this moment after putting up with my parents my entire life. And frankly, I don't care what my friends think about it. It's not like I called my parents first, they called me. I simply matched their energy. If they didn't want that response, maybe they should have thought twice before picking up the phone. That's not wrong. And I refuse to feel bad about it. Today, I even brought it up with my grandparents. They told me I should have just ignored the call and blocked my parents right away. But they didn't seem bothered by the fact that I had been harsh. If anything, they agreed. My parents earned that treatment with their own actions. It's been 3 days since that phone call, and I haven't received any more messages from them. Hopefully, that means they finally decided to leave me alone. On another note, my maternal grandparents left today to head back home. It was a little sad to see them go since I don't get to visit them often, but they promised they'd be back soon. And the best part? All 4 of my grandparents are planning to take me to college when I move in. Honestly, I can't wait. Update 2. Hey, so 2 days ago, I posted my last update, thinking my parents had finally left me alone. I definitely spoke too soon. Today, they showed up at my grandparents' house, probably because they weren't ready to let go of their precious inheritance. But they're so ridiculously entitled that they don't even realize they can't just barge in and demand things, especially after everything they've done. If they had any common sense, they would have at least pretended to be apologetic. Even if they didn't mean it, faking remorse would have been the smart move. But no. Instead, they showed up with attitude and immediately started arguing with my grandparents at the door. When they saw me in the background, telling my grandparents to just shut the door and ignore them, my mom lost it. She called me a cuss word and then flat out accused me of being a selfish brat for snitching on them, especially over something so trivial. And then she went even further. She told me I wasn't even good enough to get into Stanford in the first place, so I needed to stop acting like the victim. That hit a nerve. I hadn't planned on interacting with them at all, but the moment she said that, I snapped. I started screaming back, telling her that maybe I could have gotten in if she and Dad hadn't sabotaged me first. But thanks to their insecurities, I never even got the chance. That's when my grandparents stepped in. Seeing how agitated I was getting, they slammed the door shut and told my parents to leave or they'd call the cops. But my parents still wouldn't let it go. They just stood outside, yelling about how unfair all of this was. My dad, in particular, kept trying to plead his case to my grandparents, throwing me under the bus in the process. He claimed that if I had gotten into Stanford, I never would have stopped bragging about it, and that would have been damaging to my brother's mental health. According to him, they weren't trying to hurt me. They were just looking out for the family and keeping things balanced. As if that was some kind of valid excuse for ruining my opportunity. Eventually, my grandpa had had enough. He turned on the sprinklers. And only then did my parents finally leave. Afterward, my grandpa reassured me that if they ever showed up again, he wouldn't waste his breath arguing. He'd just call the cops and let them deal with it. So I don't have to worry about them anymore. Honestly, I feel better now. At least I got it out of my system. Could I have ignored them completely? Sure. But it's done now, and I'm moving on. Update 3. Hey everyone, it's been a couple of months since I last had any interaction with my parents. From what my grandpa told me, they did try showing up one more time to argue with my grandparents, but this time, he didn't even entertain them. He called the cops and had them removed. I wasn't home when it happened. I was out with a couple of friends. Not the ones who criticized me, by the way. I'm not in touch with them anymore, and honestly, I'm perfectly fine with that. I've realized that life becomes so much easier when you cut out the people who don't actually care about you or your well-being. Right now, I only keep in touch with a handful of real friends and, of course, my grandparents. As for my extended family, most of them aren't speaking to my parents either. They know we had a major falling out, and even though they don't have all the details, they do know enough to stay out of it, and they've chosen not to be on my parents' side. 3 weeks ago, I started college. And honestly, it's been great. I've made a lot of new friends, and my classes are genuinely interesting. I know it's going to be a challenge, but I'm more than ready to put in the work. More than anything, I want to make something of myself, not just for my own future, but because one day, I want to give back to my grandparents. They've done so much for me, and I'll never take that for granted. Right now, life is good. No, I'm not at Stanford, but I'm at a really good school, and that's what matters. Because no matter what, I will make the most of this opportunity.